Did Hollywood's brightest stars leave their own children in the dark? Behind the glamour, the Oscars, and the perfect studio smiles, some legendary names were accused of creating homes filled with silence, rejection, secrets, and pain. In this video, we uncover 15 classic Hollywood celebrities whose children felt abandoned, neglected, or erased from the story. And one case is so cold, it changed the meaning of fame forever. Number 15. Errol Flynn. The screen loved him as a fearless hero, but real life was far less noble. Errol Flynn became Hollywood's ultimate swashbuckler, the man who could swing from a ship's mast, steal a scene with a grin, and make danger look romantic. But behind that charm was a life crowded with scandal, drinking, affairs, lawsuits, and broken relationships. Flynn had children from multiple marriages, yet his restless lifestyle made him seem more like a passing legend than a steady father. His image was built on escape from responsibility, from scandal, from aging, from ordinary family life. And that is what makes his story sting. Hollywood sold him as the perfect romantic adventurer, but for his children, the adventure often meant absence. Number 14. Peter Sellers. Some fathers disappear by leaving the house. Peter Sellers seemed to disappear by becoming everyone except himself. On screen, he was brilliant, hilarious, unpredictable, the comic genius behind unforgettable characters who could change his voice, face, and personality like a magician. But that same emptiness haunted his private life. Sellers was known for emotional distance, failed marriages, insecurity, and complicated relationships with his children. The wound became even sharper after his death, when reports about his will suggested his children received very little compared with his final wife. For a man who made millions laugh, the family ending felt painfully cold. His legacy proves something uncomfortable. Sometimes the performer who can become anybody struggles most to be present for the people who need him. Number 13. Jerry Lewis. The laughter was legendary, but the family silence was louder. Jerry Lewis spent decades as one of America's most beloved entertainers, a rubber-faced comic genius who could turn chaos into applause and pain into punchlines. Audiences saw the clown, the humanitarian, the tireless performer. But behind the curtain, his relationship with the sons from his first marriage became painfully fractured. The most shocking moment came after his death, when it became public that Lewis had intentionally excluded those sons and their descendants from his will. That single legal line turned a private family wound into a public Hollywood headline. It was not just about money. It felt like a final statement, cold and permanent, written after years of distance. For a man who built his career on making strangers feel joy, the ending with his own children carried a bitter irony. Sometimes, Hollywood's biggest laugh leaves the deepest silence at home. Number 12. Orson Welles. Genius can fill a movie screen and still leave a child waiting by the door. Orson Welles was one of the most brilliant figures Hollywood ever produced. A director, actor, writer, and restless creative force who seemed too large for any studio, city, or marriage to contain. But that greatness came with a private cost. Welles lived like a man constantly chasing the next masterpiece, moving between projects, countries, financial trouble, unfinished films, and complicated romances. His children grew up around a father whose presence could feel rare, dazzling, and unreachable all at once. When he appeared, he could be charming and unforgettable. When he vanished, the absence became part of the family story. That is what makes Welles such a haunting entry. He understood drama, memory, and loss better than almost anyone. Yet in his own home, he often became the missing character. Number 11. John Drew Barrymore. Some Hollywood legacies are inherited like crowns, but others feel more like curses. John Drew Barrymore came from one of America's most famous acting families, carrying a name that already sounded legendary before he ever stepped in front of a camera. But fame did not turn him into a stable father. To many viewers today, his most painful legacy is not a performance, but the absence his daughter, Drew Barrymore, grew up describing. Drew became famous shockingly young, thrown into the machine of celebrity while her own home life was already unstable and exposed. Her father was often portrayed as distant, troubled, and unreliable, more like a shadow from a famous bloodline than a steady parent guiding her through childhood. That absence mattered because Drew was not just any child. She was a child star surrounded by adults, money, pressure, and danger far too early. In that world, a present father could have changed everything. Instead, John Drew Barrymore became another reminder that a famous last name does not guarantee protection. Sometimes, it only makes the wound more public. Number 10. Tony Curtis. The smile was movie star perfect, but the family story behind it was anything but polished. Tony Curtis had the charm, the looks, the swagger, and the kind of screen presence that made Hollywood treat him like royalty. He rose from a rough childhood to become one of the most recognizable leading men of his era, starring in classics, marrying famous women, and living inside the glamorous spotlight. But his children often described a much colder reality. Curtis was not remembered by all of them as a warm, dependable father. His relationship with several of his children became distant, complicated, and painful, especially as his career, marriages, and personal life shifted around him. The most controversial detail came later, when reports said he intentionally left his children out of his will. That turned years of family distance into a final public statement. It made people look back at the handsome star differently. Behind the tuxedos, headlines, and romantic image was a father whose legacy at home felt fractured. Tony Curtis proves that Hollywood charm can win an audience and still fail a family. Number 9. Henry Fonda. Not every absent father leaves the room. Some stay nearby and still feel impossible to reach. Henry Fonda was respected as one of Hollywood's great moral faces, the kind of actor audiences trusted instinctively. He played honest men, quiet heroes, and figures of decency with such conviction that viewers almost assumed the man and the image were the same. But inside his family, the story was more complicated. His children, Jane Fonda and Peter Fonda, later spoke about a father who could be emotionally closed, distant, and difficult to truly know. Henry was not portrayed as a reckless scandal machine like some stars on this list. That is what makes his case more unsettling. His distance was quieter. It lived in silence, restraint, emotional absence, and the painful feeling that approval had to be earned but rarely arrived. Jane and Peter both became famous in their own right, yet their relationship with their father remained marked by longing and tension. Henry Fonda's story is not about loud abandonment. It is about the cold kind, the kind that sits at the dinner table and still leaves children feeling alone. Number 8. Spencer Tracy. The tragedy of Spencer Tracy was not that he did not care. It was that guilt slowly built a wall where love should have stood. To the public, Tracy was the serious, powerful, deeply human actor who made every performance feel honest. He was admired for his natural style, his emotional weight, and that rare screen presence that made silence feel louder than dialogue. But inside his family life, silence had a darker meaning. His son John was born deaf, and Tracy reportedly carried intense guilt over it, as if fatherhood had handed him a pain he did not know how to face. Instead of drawing closer, he often seemed to retreat. His marriage to Louise Tracy continued legally, but his private life became divided by alcoholism, long absences, career demands, and his famous relationship with Katharine Hepburn. The result was a family story filled with distance, duty, and emotional confusion. Tracy was not a simple villain. That is what makes him more painful. He was a man capable of extraordinary emotional truth on screen, yet at home, the truth became harder to confront. His son needed presence, patience, and steadiness. Tracy's guilt may have been real, but guilt is not the same as parenting. In the end, his story feels like one of old Hollywood's quietest wounds. A father admired for understanding human pain, while his own family lived with the pain of his absence. Number 7. Lana Turner. Some Hollywood mothers were trapped by fame, but Lana Turner lived inside a spotlight so hot it seemed to burn everything around her. She was the ultimate glamour figure, blonde, polished, seductive, and packaged by the studio system as a fantasy woman before she had much chance to become an ordinary one. But behind the satin gowns and magazine covers was a daughter, Cheryl Crane, growing up in a world filled with cameras, adult secrets, unstable romances, and emotional distance. Turner's career demanded constant attention, and her private life became a revolving door of marriages, scandal, and public fascination. Cheryl later described a childhood that could feel lonely and complicated, with glamour everywhere but safety harder to find. The most infamous rupture came in the Johnny Stompanato tragedy, when Cheryl killed Turner's violent boyfriend in what was ruled a justifiable homicide. Suddenly, the daughter who had grown up in the shadow of her mother's fame was pushed into one of Hollywood's darkest headlines. That is why Lana Turner's story cuts deeper than a simple accusation of neglect. She was not just absent because of work. She was part of a Hollywood machine that turned private chaos into public spectacle. Her daughter's childhood became tangled with the price of being raised beside a legend. Turner may have loved her child, but love alone could not protect Cheryl from the storms created around that fame. In old Hollywood, glamour often looked like gold from the outside, but inside the home, it could feel like a locked room. Number 6. Judy Garland. The saddest part of Judy Garland's story is that she was both a wounded child and a struggling mother. Hollywood did not simply make her famous, it consumed her early, controlled her body, shaped her image, and pushed her into a lifetime of pressure before she was old enough to understand the cost. By the time she had children of her own, Liza Minnelli, Lorna Luft, and Joey Luft, Garland was already fighting exhaustion, addiction, emotional instability, and the brutal aftershocks of studio-era abuse. That does not make her a heartless parent. In fact, many accounts describe her as loving, funny, and deeply attached to her children. But love can become unstable when the parent is drowning. Her children grew up around canceled performances, financial trouble, mood swings, health crises, and moments where childhood had to end too soon. Lorna Luft later spoke about the painful reality of watching her mother struggle, and how addiction forced the children to understand adult fear before they should have had to. That is what makes Garland's entry so emotionally complicated. She was not the cold Hollywood parent who simply turned away. She was a broken star, trying to give love while still bleeding from the machine that built her. But for a child, pain does not become painless just because the parent has reasons. Judy Garland remains one of the most tragic examples on this list because her children were not rejected by a lack of love. They were hurt by a life so chaotic that love could not always protect them. Number 5. Bette Davis. The camera saw steel, but inside her family, that same steel became a weapon. Bette Davis was not just a movie star, she was a force of nature. She fought studios, stole scenes, played complicated women before Hollywood knew what to do with complicated women, and built a career on refusing to be soft for anybody. But the very qualities that made her legendary on screen became far more painful when they entered her home. Her daughter, B.D. Hyman, later published a memoir that painted Davis as controlling, harsh, emotionally exhausting, and impossible to please. The book did not just create gossip. It detonated one of the most public mother-daughter wars in classic Hollywood history. Davis felt betrayed. Hyman presented herself as wounded. The audience watched the private family break become another Hollywood spectacle. What makes this entry so uncomfortable is that Davis had spent her career playing women who survived betrayal, loneliness, cruelty, and pride. But in real life, her own daughter described growing up under that same storm. Supporters of Davis argued the memoir was unfair and opportunistic, while others saw it as the voice of a child finally speaking after years of emotional pressure. Either way, the damage was permanent. The relationship collapsed into public bitterness, and the warm mother-daughter ending never came. Davis once looked like the woman who could outfight the whole world, but family required something different from fighting. It required tenderness, patience, and surrender. And that may have been the one role Bette Davis could never fully perform. Number 4. Bing Crosby. The voice sounded like Christmas, but the memories inside his house were anything but peaceful. Bing Crosby was sold to the world as warmth itself. The relaxed crooner, the charming screen presence, the man whose songs made millions feel safe, sentimental, and at home. But his eldest son, Gary Crosby, later shattered that image with his memoir, Going My Own Way, accusing his father of severe physical punishment, emotional coldness, and a home ruled more by fear than affection. That contrast is what makes Bing's story so disturbing. Public Bing was gentle, smooth, almost fatherly to America. Private Bing, according to Gary's account, could be strict, distant, and frightening. Other family members later offered different perspectives, which makes the story complicated rather than simple. But the power of Gary's accusation came from the emotional detail. A child remembering not the celebrity, not the applause, not the holiday records, but the dread of disappointing his father. In old Hollywood, image was everything. Studios polished their stars until they became symbols, and Crosby became a symbol of comfort. Yet the children of symbols do not live with posters. They live with the person behind the door. That is why this entry cuts so sharply. Even if every family member did not tell the story the same way, the wound became part of Crosby's legacy forever. It forced audiences to ask a painful question. How could a man who gave the world such tenderness leave his own son remembering fear? Sometimes the softest voice on the radio can hide the coldest silence at home. Number 3. Marlon Brando. Some Hollywood families crack quietly. Marlon Brando's seemed to collapse under the weight of its own legend. Brando was one of the greatest actors who ever lived. A man who changed screen acting forever with raw emotion, dangerous stillness, and a presence that made other performers look artificial. But away from the camera, his family life became a maze of broken relationships, many children, emotional distance, wealth, scandal, and tragedy. Brando often spoke like a man deeply aware of suffering, injustice, and human damage. Yet his own children grew up inside a world that could feel unstable and exposed. The darkest chapter involved his son Christian and his daughter Cheyenne. Christian Brando fatally shot Dag Drolet, Cheyenne's partner, at Brando's home in 1990. The case became a media earthquake, dragging the Brando family's private pain into worldwide headlines. Cheyenne's later death made the story even more devastating, turning what might have been a scandal into something closer to a family curse. It would be unfair to reduce all of that tragedy to one simple cause, but it is impossible to ignore the atmosphere around it. Fame, absence, emotional chaos, and children orbiting a father too enormous, too wounded, and too unreachable to give them ordinary safety. Brando gave cinema some of its most honest human performances, but his home became proof that emotional genius on screen does not guarantee emotional presence in real life. His legacy is magnificent, but the family shadow behind it is brutal. In the end, Marlon Brando did not just leave behind masterpieces. He left behind questions no applause could drown out. Number 2. Clark Gable. The king of Hollywood had a secret he never publicly crowned. Clark Gable was the kind of star the studio system protected like national property. Masculine, polished, untouchable, and built for posters, romance, and box office worship. But behind that perfectly controlled image was one of old Hollywood's most painful hidden child stories. During the making of Call of the Wild, Gable had a relationship with Loretta Young, and their daughter, Judy Lewis, was born into a world where scandal could destroy careers overnight. An unmarried pregnancy involving two major stars was not treated like private life. It was treated like a threat to the entire Hollywood machine. So the truth was buried. Judy was placed in an orphanage for a time, then brought back and presented publicly as Loretta Young's adopted daughter. Gable, meanwhile, never publicly acknowledged her as his child. That is what makes this story so cold. It was not just one absent father. It was a whole industry built around protecting a man's image while a little girl grew up inside a lie. Judy later recognized the truth not through a loving confession, but through whispers, resemblance, and painful discovery. Gable remained the heroic Rhett Butler to millions, the charming leading man who could command a screen with one eyebrow and one line. But for Judy Lewis, the fantasy had a missing father at the center of it. This entry is not just about abandonment, it is about how fame can rewrite a child's identity before that child is old enough to ask questions. Hollywood protected the legend and left the daughter to inherit the silence.
Number 1. Joan Crawford. No Hollywood parenting scandal hit harder than the one attached to Joan Crawford, because it did not stay behind mansion doors. It became a cultural earthquake. Crawford was a survivor, a self-made star, a woman who clawed her way from poverty into movie royalty through discipline, beauty, ambition, and pure force of will. On screen, she looked controlled, glamorous, and untouchable. But after her death, her adopted daughter Christina Crawford published Mommy Dearest, a memoir that accused Joan of cruelty, emotional abuse, control, and terrifying punishment. The book changed everything. Suddenly, the public was not just watching an old Hollywood icon. They were re-examining the cost of living inside her house. Supporters of Joan argued the book exaggerated or distorted the truth. Others believed Christina had finally exposed the darkness behind one of Hollywood's most polished images. But the damage to Crawford's legacy was permanent, especially because her will added another cruel final note. Joan disinherited Christina and Christopher, famously stating it was for reasons known to them. That line became almost as chilling as the accusations themselves: short, legal, and emotionally brutal. What makes Crawford the strongest number 1 is not only the alleged mistreatment. It is the way her story became the ultimate symbol of glamorous motherhood turned nightmare. She adopted children partly inside a Hollywood culture that rewarded perfect family images. Yet the family image later collapsed into one of the most famous accusations in celebrity history. Joan Crawford may have conquered studios, directors, rivals, and audiences, but the one role that destroyed her reputation was not on screen. It was the role of mother. And in the end, no Oscar could silence what her daughter said happened at home. Behind every golden statue, there can be a broken family story no camera ever captured. These stars became legends, but their children carried the private cost of fame, silence, rejection, and pain. Some cases were complicated, some were brutal, and some still feel unresolved. And that is why old Hollywood's brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows.